The crisp autumn air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor, blending with the distant honking of taxis and the hum of hurried footsteps. Chicago was alive as always, its towering skyscrapers casting long shadows over the bustling sidewalks. Amid the city's ceaseless rhythm, one figure moved with quiet contemplation. Barron Trump, now 18, walked with his hands tucked into the pockets of his navy jacket. The morning had been spent at a private charity event, a gathering of polished speeches and polite handshakes. But despite the glamour, something lingered in his mind. A question he couldn't shake. What does real struggle look like? Not the kind discussed in boardrooms, but the kind that happens in the cracks of society, where no cameras are rolling, where people fall through without a second thought. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the city's energy shifting around him. That was until a voice, small, fragile, cut through the noise. "Excuse me, can you spare $1?" Barron stopped. The words weren't shouted or aggressively demanded. They were hesitant, almost apologetic, like a plea from someone who had already accepted being ignored. He turned his head and spotted a boy, no older than 10, sitting on the cold pavement. His clothes were thin, tattered, a size too small for the dropping temperature. His arms were wrapped tightly around himself, but it wasn't just the cold that made him shrink inward. His eyes, dull with exhaustion, told a different story. The kind that most people walked past without a second glance. Beside him sat a worn-out cardboard sign, its edges frayed from days, maybe weeks, on the street. "Hungry and alone. Please help." For a moment Barron just stood there, frozen. The bustling city around him faded into the background. He had seen poverty before, on the news, in reports, but this was different. This was right in front of him, and it had a name. He just didn't know it yet. And in that moment, Barron Trump made a decision, one that would change both their lives forever. For a brief moment the world around Barron seemed to stand still. The roaring city, the flashing billboards, the endless sea of people, they all faded into a distant blur. All that remained was the boy sitting in front of him, curled up against the chill of the Chicago streets. Barron crouched down, meeting the child's gaze. His eyes, deep brown but lifeless, held the kind of exhaustion no 10-year-old should ever know. "What's your name?" Barron asked gently. The boy hesitated, as if saying his own name out loud would somehow make his existence more real, more painful. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "Daniel." Daniel, a simple name, yet in that moment it carried the weight of an entire world Barron knew nothing about. "Daniel, where's your family? Are you out here alone?" The boy's fingers clenched tighter around the frayed straps of his too small backpack. He stared at the pavement, his breath shallow and uneven. "My dad, he's gone." His voice cracked and he swallowed hard before continuing. "And my mom, she left me here." Barron felt something in his chest tighten. "She left you?" he echoed, unable to mask the disbelief in his voice. Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "She said she'd come back," he whispered, his voice laced with a fragile hope that had long since faded into something colder, something closer to acceptance. "But she didn't." Barron exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had spent his life in a world of privilege, where problems were discussed, analyzed, and solved with phone calls and meetings. But this wasn't some abstract issue. This was a child, alone on the streets, abandoned by the one person who was supposed to protect him. A mother's absence wasn't just a missing piece, it was a wound, one that left scars too deep for words. "How long have you been out here?" Barron asked, his voice softer now. Daniel shrugged, the motion small and defeated. "I don't know. A few days, I guess. I get hungry, and I don't know what else to do." That was it. That was all. Not anger, not resentment, just quiet acceptance. As if Daniel had already learned that life had no place for kids like him. Something inside Barron snapped. He refused to let this moment pass like every other stranger who had walked by. He wouldn't be another person who looked away. He sat down on the cold pavement beside Daniel, ignoring the looks from passers-by. "You're not alone anymore," Barron said firmly. Daniel looked at him, confusion flickering across his face. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "Nobody else stops." Barron held his gaze, searching for the right words. "Because sometimes we just need someone to listen," he said. "And because you deserve better than this." Reaching into his wallet, Barron pulled out a $20 bill and handed it to Daniel. But deep down, he knew money wasn't the answer. He had resources, he had connections, and right now, he had a choice. He could walk away like everyone else, or he could change this boy's life forever. Barron made his decision. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number. His voice was steady, determined. "I need your help, it's urgent." Barron Trump had made up his mind. Walking away wasn't an option. Still sitting beside Daniel on the freezing pavement, he held the phone to his ear, waiting as the line rang. His heart pounded, not from hesitation, but from urgency. He wasn't just trying to help, he was racing against time. "Hey, it's me. I need a favor. A big one." On the other end of the line was one of his trusted contacts, someone who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. Barron wasn't going to let Daniel slip through the cracks like so many others. As he spoke, he glanced down at Daniel, who was still staring at the $20 bill in his hands as if it were something unreal. But Barron knew what the boy really needed wasn't just money, it was hope. "We need to find his mother," Barron continued. "Her name is Isabel. Last known whereabouts? No idea, but I need you to track her down. Fast." There was a pause. Then came the reply. "This won't be easy. People who abandon their kids don't exactly leave breadcrumbs." "Do what you have to do," Barron said, his voice unwavering. Daniel watched him, brows furrowed in confusion. No one had ever fought for him before. No one had ever made a call for him. "What if she doesn't want me?" Daniel asked quietly. Barron met his gaze, steady and certain. "Then we'll find another way. But we don't give up until we know for sure." He helped Daniel to his feet, guiding him toward a small cafe nearby where they could get a warm meal while waiting for news. The boy was hesitant. Trust didn't come easy when the world had taught you to expect disappointment. As they sat inside, Daniel hesitantly picked at a plate of pancakes, unsure whether to believe any of this was real. Then Barron's phone buzzed. They had found her. Isabel was still in Chicago, but barely. She had been seen in a rundown motel on the south side, a place notorious for housing the lost, the forgotten, and those too far gone to save themselves. Barron didn't hesitate. "Come on, we're going to her." Daniel's fork clattered onto the plate. "Wait, now? Now?" As they left the cafe, the air felt heavier, charged with something between hope and dread. What kind of woman abandons her child and disappears into the city's shadows? Would she even care that Daniel was still waiting for her? "Before we go any further, I need you to stop right here. If you've been following this story, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next, you won't believe." They arrived at the motel just as the sun began to set, the orange glow casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. The building was exactly what Barron had expected. A place where people disappeared, not where they were found. He stepped inside, Daniel trailing behind, eyes darting nervously. The hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke and regret. A flickering light overhead cast an unsettling glow. A man at the front desk barely looked up. "You looking for a room?" "No," Barron said, his tone firm. "We're looking for someone." "Isabel," the man smirked. "Lot of Isabellos come through here, can't help you." Barron pulled out his wallet, sliding a $100 bill across the counter. The man sighed, tucking it away before nodding toward the farthest room down the hall. "She won't like being disturbed," he muttered. Barron squared his shoulders, turning to Daniel. "Are you ready for this?" The boy hesitated but nodded. Together they walked down the dimly lit hallway, the floor creaking beneath their steps. When they reached the door, Barron knocked. There was silence. Then shuffling from inside. A moment later, the door cracked open, just enough for a tired, hollow-eyed woman to peer out. Her gaze landed on Barron first, skeptical, guarded. Then, her eyes drifted downward and landed on Daniel. Her breath hitched. "Mom?" Daniel whispered. The door opened wider, and in that instant Barron knew. This was only the beginning. For a moment the world stood still. Isabel's hollow eyes flickered with recognition, but something darker loomed beneath. Guilt, fear, and the unbearable weight of a past she had tried to forget. Daniel took a hesitant step forward, his small fingers tightening around the strap of his tattered backpack. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. "How do you greet the mother who left you behind?" "Mom?" he whispered again, his voice barely audible. Isabel's grip on the door trembled. She blinked, as if unsure whether the boy in front of her was real or just another cruel trick her mind was playing on her. "Daniel?" Her voice was raw, as if the name had been buried under years of self-destruction. Barron watched her closely. He had seen regret before. But this wasn't just regret. This was a woman drowning, barely keeping her head above the surface. Then, like a reflex, Isabel's expression hardened. The tenderness in her gaze vanished, replaced by something cold, defensive. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice sharp but unsteady. "I told you not to wait for me." Daniel flinched, his small frame shrinking. Barron stepped in, his voice firm but measured. "He's been living on the streets, Isabel. He's been waiting for you." Isabel let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "And what? You think you can just show up here, throw that in my face, and suddenly everything gets fixed?" Her words were laced with bitterness, but her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't angry at Daniel. She was angry at herself. "You don't understand," she continued, folding her arms over her frail frame. "I left because I had to. Because I couldn't be the mother he needed." Daniel's voice finally broke through, shaky but filled with something neither of them expected. Anger. "You didn't even try," he blurted out. Isabel's body stiffened. "Dad died and you just left." Daniel's voice cracked. "I waited for you, Mom. Every single day, I waited." A muscle in Isabel's jaw tightened, but she had no defense. She looked away, blinking rapidly as if trying to force back the tears threatening to spill over. Barron took a step forward, his voice quieter now. "He still loves you, Isabel. That's why he's here." She let out a shaky breath, rubbing a hand over her face. Years of guilt, grief, and self-destruction had hardened her, but now, faced with her son, those walls were beginning to crack. But just as quickly she reinforced them. "It's too late." Her voice wavered. "He's better off without me." Daniel's small hands clenched into fists. "You don't get to decide that," he shot back. "You left me, but I never stopped needing you." Isabel staggered back a step, her breath hitching. The weight of her son's words hit like a wrecking ball. Barron saw the shift, the way her shoulders trembled, the way her lips parted but no sound came out. This was the moment. The breaking point. "You think you've already failed him?" Barron asked, his voice unwavering. "Then prove yourself wrong." Isabel shook her head, pressing her fingers against her temples as if trying to silence the voices in her own mind. "I don't know how." The words barely escaped her lips. Barron softened, stepping closer. "You don't have to do it alone." For the first time, Isabel looked at Daniel, not just as a reminder of her past mistakes, but as her son, a boy who, despite everything, still stood there, waiting for her. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I don't deserve him," she choked out. Barron exhaled. "Maybe not, but he deserves a mother who fights for him. So, fight." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Isabel's fingers curled around the edge of the door, torn between closing it forever or stepping back into the life she abandoned. Then, she exhaled. A shuddering, broken breath. She wiped at her face, looked at Daniel, and whispered, "What do I have to do?" And, just like that, a door that had been closed for too long finally cracked open. For a moment, Isabel just stood there, her fingers trembling as she gripped the doorframe. The weight of years of regret, failure, and shame hung between her and Daniel like an invisible wall, but for the first time she wasn't running. She had asked the question, "What do I have to do?" and now, there was no turning back. Barron took a steady breath. "First, you have to be willing to fight for yourself," he said. "Not just for Daniel, for you." Isabel swallowed hard, her hollow eyes flickering with uncertainty. "And if I can't," she whispered. "Then we'll fight for you until you can," Barron replied without hesitation. Daniel's small voice broke through, fragile but filled with something Isabel hadn't heard in years. Hope. "Do you mean it, Mom?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Do you want to come back?" Isabel hesitated, not because she didn't love him, but because loving him meant confronting everything she had buried. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, she didn't see a reminder of her failures. she saw her son. The little boy who had once clung to her leg, who had fallen asleep in her arms, who had needed her even when she wasn't there. And in that moment she made a choice. She nodded, tears slipping down her face. "Yes, baby, I do." Daniel let out a shaky breath, as if he had been holding it for years. Barron didn't waste another second. He pulled out his phone and made the call. Within the hour, a car arrived to take Isabel to a rehabilitation center on the outskirts of the city. As they stood outside the motel, waiting, Isabel wrapped her arms around herself, the cold night air biting through her thin jacket. She looked lost, fragile, but not broken. Not anymore. "It's not going to be easy," Barron told her. She let out a small, breathy laugh. "Nothing ever is." "Then don't quit." When the car pulled up, the driver stepped out, holding the door open. Isabel turned to Daniel, hesitating. "I don't know how long this will take," she admitted. Daniel took a step forward, his voice stronger than before. "I'll wait." Isabel let out a soft sob, cupping his face in her hands before pulling him into a tight hug. "I love you, sweetheart," she whispered. "I love you too, Mom," Daniel murmured against her shoulder. As Isabel climbed into the car, Barron knelt beside Daniel. "You did the right thing, standing up for her." Daniel wiped at his eyes. "Do you think she'll really change?" Barron looked at the retreating car, his expression thoughtful. "I think she just took the first step, and that's what matters." Before we move forward, take a second to hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story, it's only just beginning. Over the next few weeks, Isabel fought harder than she ever had. The days in rehab were brutal, the withdrawals, the therapy sessions, the painful realizations of what she had lost. It was a war she had to face every single day. But she did. She didn't run. She didn't quit, and every time she felt like she might, she remembered the little boy who had never stopped waiting for her. Daniel visited as often as he could, each time seeing more and more of the mother he had lost. Her eyes became brighter, her voice steadier. For the first time in years, she was healing. And Barron? He stayed in the background, making sure she had the support she needed. Because sometimes, a second chance isn't about erasing the past, it's about proving the future can still be rewritten. Months had passed. The air was warmer now, carrying the scent of spring, as if the world itself had been waiting for a fresh start. Daniel stood outside the rehabilitation center, shifting on his foot. His hands clutched the straps of his backpack, a nervous habit he hadn't quite shaken. Today was the day. The door opened and there she was, Isabel. She looked different, healthier, stronger. The deep shadows under her eyes had faded, replaced by something softer. Something Daniel hadn't seen in years. Hope. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Isabel took a hesitant step forward. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice was shaky but warm, filled with a mother's love that had never truly left. Daniel's breath hitched. He wanted to be angry, to ask why it had taken so long, but when he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw a mother who had fought her way back to him. He ran. Throwing himself into her arms, he held on as if he might lose her again. "I missed you, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. Isabel sobbed, holding him tight. "I'm here now, and I'm never leaving again." Barron stood a few feet away, watching in silence, a small smile on his face. He had kept his promise. "Come on," he said, tossing Isabel a set of keys. "You've got a new home waiting for you." And for the first time in a long time, they walked forward, together. As the car pulled up in front of the small but cozy apartment, Isabel let out a shaky breath. She clutched the keys in her hands, staring at the door like it was some impossible dream. "This is really ours?" she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. Barron nodded. "It's not much, but it's a start. A place to rebuild." Daniel didn't wait. He rushed inside, his laughter filling the empty space like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He ran his fingers over the kitchen counters, peeked into the small bedroom. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home. Isabel stood in the doorway, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't deserve this." Barron shook his head. "No one's perfect, Isabel. What matters is that you didn't give up." She turned to him, her voice trembling. "Why did you do all this? For us?" He exhaled, watching Daniel run through the apartment. his face finally free of the weight he had carried for too long. Because everyone deserves a second chance. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe for more stories of hope, redemption, and the power of kindness. Because sometimes, one act of compassion is all it takes to change a life. And together, we can build a world where no one is left behind.